awake not to gentle sunlight, but to the restless scurrying of rats gnawing behind the crumbling woodwork. Your sheets are clammy, sodden by the relentless humidity, a sticky tropical moisture that seeps into everything, skin and soul alike. The climate never relents here, not even in the thin imitation of winter that visits this forsaken rock. For 6 years, these have been your mornings, the chorus of pests in the walls, the ache in your bones, the unchanging dullness outside your window. 1,000 miles from anywhere, your world has shrunk to the confines of this bleak island, St. Helena, surrounded by an ocean that is more prison than promise. The sea's surface is iron gray, endless, and utterly indifferent. You are Napoleon Bonaparte. On this bleak May morning in 1821, your body feels as ancient as the stones beneath you, burning from within with a fire that no opium can smother. You do not say it aloud, not to your few remaining companions, not even to yourself, but you know, with the clarity of a dying man, that you are being murdered. Not with a blade or a shot, but with poison, arsenic perhaps, slipped quietly into your wine, your bread, your medicine. You taste metal every time you swallow. Your legs, which once strode across empires, now tremble beneath the weight of your own diminished frame, barely able to carry you the short steps to the chamber pot. The noises outside, British sentries changing guard, the crunch of boots on volcanic gravel, the click of muskets, have become as familiar as your own breath. For years you have lived in this stifling routine, watched, controlled, and gradually eroded by the passing of days and the malice of your captors. Each morning you sense your own world shrinking, your glory growing ever more distant, slipping from memory into myth. Longwood House, your place of exile, is no grand estate for a fallen emperor. It is a battered farmhouse, battered by Atlantic gales and crawling with mold. The walls are blotched and peeling, wallpaper drooping in ribbons, rain leaking through to pool on warped floors. It is a far cry from the palaces you once called home. Here, the loneliness is a living presence, thickening in the air, pressing on your chest as you struggle for every breath. Those loyal few who remain, Marchand, Las Cases, the handful of exiled companions watch over you with worry and resignation. They count your declining days as carefully as the guards count your footsteps. Sometimes you see them steal glances at one another, as if each wonders who will be left when you are gone, and what secrets your final hours will reveal. Even their loyalty is haunted by fear, not only for your life, but for what your death will mean. For themselves and for the legacy of an empire now scattered to the winds. You try to recall the thrill of power, the roar of cannon, the charge of cavalry, the weight of the crown. But memory too fades beneath the steady assault of pain. Sometimes late at night, dreams take you back to other battlefields, sunlit, alive, triumphant, only to wake with a start, sweat-soaked, and realize that the real enemy now is unseen and unrelenting. Death here comes by degrees, a cup, a meal, a dose, a shadow moving across the room. Even the smallest details become reminders of what you have lost.
His health is declining rapidly,
The taste
monsieur.
of bread is tinged with
Fear the
bitterness.
worst.
Wine, once a pleasure, is now a test of trust. Each cough, each cramp is a warning. You begin to suspect everyone, your British jailers, your French servants, perhaps even the friends who stayed at your side. Every glance, every whispered conversation is heavy with suspicion.
This is sensitive
Who is
information.
plotting? Who is afraid?
We understand the implications.
Who is simply waiting for you to die? And Yet in this damp and crumbling room, in the long hush before dawn, you are still Napoleon. Each breath you draw, however labored, still carries the echo of centuries, the weight of battles fought and lost, and the knowledge that history itself waits just outside the door to pass its judgment. You lie back and listen. The slow beat of your heart, the sigh of the Atlantic wind, the distant murmurs of guards. Time drips by, as slow and poisonous as the fate seeping through your blood. You know that your death will not just be the end of a man, but the beginning of a mystery that will haunt generations. And as you drift between pain and restless sleep, one thought lingers. You, Napoleon Bonaparte, may not be allowed to choose the manner of your death, but you will shape the legend that follows. When Napoleon first set foot on the island of St. Helena, he believed he had already tasted every flavor of loneliness. From the windswept deserts of Egypt to the quiet days of exile on Elba. But Longwood House would teach him a final bitter lesson. What it meant to be stripped of dignity and hope, one humid night at a time. This was not a palace, nor even a proper manor. Longwood was an aging farmhouse perched on a plateau scoured by wind and rain. A place where the Emperor of Europe now found himself at the mercy of leaking roofs and rotten floorboards. Picture it. The walls stained and peeling, wallpaper hanging in tatters like defeated flags, the very air thick with the smell of damp and old illness. Rain invaded through the cracks, turning the floors to marshes. The Atlantic fog, so dense it seemed alive, pressed through every window, clinging to clothes, to skin, to the thoughts of everyone inside. On stormy nights, the house shook with every gust. The roof groaned, and the howling wind seemed to mourn for all who had ever been exiled here. Napoleon was not entirely alone. Around him clustered the remnants of his former court. Loyal valet Louis Marchand, the meticulous Count Emmanuel de las Cases, secretly recording every humiliation for future generations, Dr. Barry O'Mara, whose medical concerns sometimes bordered on pity. Other French exiles hovered in orbit, each with their own wounds and their own reasons for staying, whether out of loyalty, desperation, or the inability to return home to a changed France. Their faces bore the same look, part defiance, part exhaustion, and always the haunted eyes of witnesses to the end of an era. For the British guards assigned to Longwood, the place was just as much a hardship post as a duty. Their letters home described a world of endless drizzle, mud, and suspicion. Neither side trusted the other, but both were united by a mutual sense of displacement. Some, like Lieutenant Basil Jackson, observed that even in decay and sickness, Napoleon still carried a presence that unsettled the garrison. The bearing of a commander reduced, but not quite erased. Here, the man who once presided over gilded banquets and parades now dined on stale bread and watered soup, with meat that often smelled off and flour that sometimes squirmed with hidden life. Mold crept up the walls, and the unrelenting damp gnawed at the bones of even the youngest, let alone a man in decline. Some nights the rats seemed to outnumber the living. Among the French entourage, the constant comparison between Longwood and the prisons of Paris became a cruel refrain. Even the Bastille was more comfortable than this, one wrote. It was not nostalgia for luxury that gnawed at them, but the way the island ground them down day after day, stripping away spirit as thoroughly as the rain stripped paint from the walls. Physical decay walked hand in hand with mental rot. Suspicion flourished in the moldy corners. Who among the servants might be bribed? Who whispered to the British? Who nursed old grudges or secret ambitions? Betrayal became not just a fear, but a way of life. A silent, contagious dread passed from room to room, no less deadly than the unknown illness wasting away the emperor. Each morning, when Napoleon managed to drag himself to the window, he looked out over a single narrow valley leading to the restless sea. That gray-blue slice of freedom taunted him with memories of past campaigns. The green fields of Italy, the golden streets of Paris, the thunder of crowds shouting his name. But the present was always there, waiting in the sound of marching boots and the cold, measuring gaze of the guards. The world had grown very small. It was in this forsaken place that the lines between conqueror and captive blurred beyond recognition. Longwood House was more than a prison. It was an unmasking chamber where not just power, but dignity, memory, and even humanity could be picked apart, as surely as the paint flaked from the windowsills. The slow physical ruin, the spreading damp, the sudden fevers, the gnawing hunger was only the visible part of a deeper collapse, a spiritual erosion more painful than any battlefield wound. And through it all, a quiet terror crept, the terror that nobody would ever know what truly happened here, or that the world would simply move on, leaving behind only rumors and the lingering, unspoken shame of what had been done to a fallen emperor in a lonely house at the edge of the world. In the summer of 1815, the world watched the Colossus of Europe stumble. The smoke had barely cleared at Waterloo when Napoleon, once master of fate, now fugitive, cast his last gamble. He surrendered to the British, hoping for mercy, perhaps even respect. Captain Maitland of HMS Bellerophon welcomed him aboard with formality and faint sympathy. There was a moment, a breath held by history when Napoleon believed England might offer him asylum. A quiet country estate, a dignified if powerless retirement. But those who had trembled at his name for 2 decades had not forgotten. Britain's government saw in every rumor a possible uprising, in every fan letter from Paris a new Bonapartist plot. France itself was fragile on the knife edge between old royalists and the still smoldering embers of revolution. The Allies, exhausted by years of war, could not risk Napoleon's charisma turning from myth to movement. No, safety lay not in his comfort, but in his absolute disappearance. The decision was swift and ruthless. Exile him farther than anyone before. Not Elba, that sunlit Mediterranean isle from which he had once slipped away to reclaim a throne, but St. Helena, a volcanic speck nearly invisible on the maps, lost in the emptiness of the South Atlantic. It was said there was nowhere on Earth further from hope. A 5-week voyage by ship, battered by southern storms, led to black cliffs rising sheer from wild seas. There would be no escape, no visitors, no rumor that could reach Paris or Rome before months had passed. St. Helena's single anchorage lay in a narrow, wind-scoured valley, watched always by British cannon and the unwavering gaze of 2,000 redcoats, posted in the end to guard one exhausted man. For the British, the cost of vigilance was almost as bitter as the price of war. Night and day, soldiers patrolled, officers scribbled reports, and ships circled like carrion birds, lest Napoleon simply vanish once more into legend. He landed on October 15, 1815. The chill of defeat wrapped around him as tightly as his greatcoat. His household, those few willing to share exile, followed, their eyes wide with disbelief at the barrenness of their new world. Napoleon's first view of Longwood House was not awe, but a deep, quiet outrage. The emperor reduced to a tenant of mildew and ruin. Yet even here, in this world's forgotten corner, echoes of betrayal traveled with him. Word arrived of friends abandoning the cause, of fortune seekers offering their services to the new Bourbon kings, of rivals in Paris raising toast to his absence. Worse still, the British themselves would quickly show that exile was not mercy, but punishment. The promises whispered on deck of comfort, of dignity, fell away with each new regulation, each meal counted and rationed, each book or letter subject to suspicion. It was a different sort of battlefield now, one without banners or bugles, where the weapon was silence and time the slowest, cruelest enemy. Napoleon's world shrank further. Rooms, paths, faces, all mapped and measured by those who feared his legend more than his living self. He understood with bitter clarity that he had not been exiled for his crimes, but for his greatness. His was a captivity designed to erase, not just a man, but the memory of him. Each day on St. Helena would become an act of resistance against disappearance, a contest between the will to endure and the machinery of oblivion. As months passed, the emperor's days became ritual. Morning walks under watchful eyes, measured conversations with suspicious guards, the endless, maddening sound of wind against stone. Letters to Europe were censored or never delivered. Visitors were rare, their presence policed by protocol and paranoia. The news, when it arrived, was months old and always bleak. Another friend dead, another hope vanished, another reminder that the world moved on without him. For Napoleon, the pain of exile was less the loss of power and more the knowledge that betrayal had become as common as the sea wind. Even those closest to him, who broke bread at his table, who shared his slow decline, could not escape suspicion. Somewhere in these final sunless years, the boundaries of trust dissolved. Loyalty, the coin of emperors, lost its value in a world governed by fear. And so, as the emperor watched the waves batter St. Helena's cliffs, he realized that here, at the edge of all things, he faced not just the prison of stone and distance, but the greater betrayal. A world determined to forget him while he was still alive. If St. Helena was Napoleon's physical prison, then Governor Hudson Lowe was its living embodiment. An ever-present nervous shadow whose anxieties became Napoleon's daily torment. Lowe arrived in April 1816, bringing with him an air of officious severity and an obsession with protocol that masked a deep-seated dread of the man he was meant to guard. His military career had been forged in paperwork, not battle. His hands accustomed more to the trembling of documents than the shaking of sabers. From the moment he set foot on the island, Lowe set about remaking exile into a system of slow suffocation. Every request from Longwood, whether for books, food, medicine, or simply a little more freedom, was met with suspicion, as though each comfort might conceal an escape plan or a secret message to waiting revolutionaries in Europe. Lowe's eyes missed nothing and trusted no one, least of all the French household he was charged to watch. He slashed Napoleon's household budget, cutting it nearly in half. Silverware and ornaments were quietly sold to afford even basic meals, while British guards doubled, sometimes triple-checked every shipment of food or bottle of wine that entered Longwood's boundaries. the emperor's world shrank not just by distance, but by design. As every pleasure or necessity became something to be bargained for, scrutinized, withheld. Napoleon's health began to falter, and when he asked for new medical attention, lo, delayed for months. Even the sickroom became a front line in this war of attrition, a place where suspicion of intrigue overruled mercy. Officers were stationed so they could see into his rooms at all hours. Even his rare outings on horseback were ringed with soldiers, alarm guns ready to fire at the faintest rumor of escape. He was forced to appear twice a day for the inspection of British officers, proof to the world that the lion was still in his cage. If he refused, Lowe threatened to break down the doors. When Napoleon withdrew further into his room, seeking solace in the copper bathtub that was now his only relief from pain, Lowe interpreted every absence as a plot. Each letter, each visitor, every minor household squabble was recorded, reported, and filed away as potential evidence of conspiracy. This architecture of cruelty was all the more effective for its subtlety. No whips, no gallows, just the grinding humiliation of being watched, denied, doubted, and managed like a dangerous animal. The emperor who had bent nations to his will was now forced to negotiate for candles, to plead for fruit, to accept that his most private moments were subject to the scrutiny of foreign eyes. Napoleon's attendants kept meticulous notes. Days when food ran short, nights when the cold bit through even the heaviest blankets, mornings when British soldiers lingered in the hallway long after their rounds. Dr. O'Meara, the Irish physician, wrote guardedly about his patient's suffering, aware that even a hint of sympathy might make him the next target of the governor's suspicion. Through it all, Lowe remained aloof, encased in regulations and anxious reports. To the world outside, he insisted that Napoleon was treated with every consideration due to his rank and person. But those living inside the walls of Longwood understood a different reality. That exile under Lowe's careful management was a death by 1,000 tiny wounds, none deep enough to spark outrage, but together more than enough to destroy. Every day under Lowe's regime was another lesson in the power of quiet cruelty. Napoleon, once the master of European destiny, had become an object lesson in how power can grind down the spirit long before the body gives way. By the time the second winter settled over St. Helena, the transformation in Napoleon was undeniable. The legendary vigor that had once driven armies and reshaped maps was dissolving, slowly, inexorably, under the weight of his mysterious illness. In the flickering lamplight of Longwood House, the emperor became a ghost of his former self. Flesh once robust and animated, now withered, features drawn tight with pain. It began with stomach complaints, the sort that seemed ordinary enough after years of stress and exile. But the pain grew sharper, more persistent, a hot razor beneath the ribs that made every meal a test of endurance. He grew prone to long, silent hours in a copper tub, seeking relief in scalding water that dulled the pain for only a moment. The skin on his face faded to a yellow-gray, the color of parchment too long in the sun. His hair, once thick and dark, fell away in ragged clumps. Each morning, valet Louis Marchand would collect what was left, a silent ritual in preparation for the coming end. Napoleon's companions watched the change with a mix of dread and helplessness. The once lively routines of Longwood faded as the emperor's world shrank to the boundaries of his sickroom. He slept little, plagued by pain and fever. Some days he seemed to disappear into the bed sheets, his eyes hooded and unresponsive, his voice so faint that only those closest could hear him. Dr. Barry O'Mara, Irish, earnest, and increasingly alarmed, struggled to explain what he saw. The symptoms refused to fit any single diagnosis. There was the constant burning in Napoleon's gut, the persistent swelling of his legs, bleeding gums, and most alarming of all, long, harrowing stretches of constipation followed by sudden, violent diarrhea. O'Mara saw patterns that did not make sense. He noted the strange metallic taste the emperor complained of, the way illness swept through the French household, sometimes sparing one and not another. In his private notes, O'Mara allowed himself a dangerous suspicion: poison. Napoleon's decline became a kind of theater of suffering for the British guards and officers, who observed and reported each new symptom. General Gaspard Gourgaud, one of the emperor's most loyal officers, began keeping a precise record, documenting humiliations, the irregularities of food and medicine, even the way soldiers would position themselves so as to watch Napoleon bathe, stripping him of privacy and dignity alike. Isolation deepened the wound. Letters requesting a new physician went unanswered for months. Simple foods became rare luxuries. Napoleon, once decisive and unbending, was reduced to bargaining for basics. His pride eroded as surely as his health. To lose power was one thing, but to lose even the right to suffer in private. This was a defeat more total than any battlefield. Rumors swirled through the damp halls of Longwood. The flour tasted odd. The wine sometimes arrived with its seal already broken. Meat spoiled mysteriously in the storeroom. Some members of Napoleon's household fell ill with similar symptoms, only to recover when their diets changed. Even the rainwater gathered for drinking sometimes stank of something unnatural. But no complaint reached beyond the walls. Under Lowe's cold vigilance, every word, every request became a potential weapon against the emperor and his retinue. For Napoleon, the days blended into one another: pain, suspicion, fatigue. His legendary mind, once quick as lightning, dulled with every passing week. Friends and followers looked on in growing horror, unable to do more than bear witness as the greatest figure of their age slipped away, undone not by war or rebellion, but by the slow agony of an unseen hand. Still, in the moments between pain, flashes of the old Napoleon surfaced. A sharp comment, a distant memory of victory, the stubborn insistence on dignity even as his body failed. These glimpses, rare and precious, reminded those around him that a giant's shadow still loomed, even as the man himself grew ever more frail. Went weeks without a proper movement, only to be seized by sudden, violent diarrhea that left him too weak to stand. His skin, once ruddy and alive, faded to a waxen pallor. Napoleon, ever the rationalist, began to suspect that these symptoms were not the work of fate or frailty, but of calculation. He confided quietly to Marchand and Gourgaud that he believed he was being poisoned. At first, they dismissed the idea. What purpose would it serve to murder a dying man? But the evidence in its slow and insidious way continued to mount. It started with the food. Wine bottles arrived at Longwood with their seals broken. The flour delivered for bread sometimes carried a bitter chemical smell, unlike anything before. A barrel of preserved meat freshly arrived from Cape Town was found crawling with maggots. Most disturbing of all was the pattern. When certain people prepared or tasted Napoleon's food, illness seemed to follow. When others took over, the symptoms waned. The most suspicious figure, always nearby, always eager to help, was Count Charles de Montholon. Montholon, aristocrat, supposed friend, and now chief administrator of the exiled household, kept close control over food, medicine, and the daily rhythms of Longwood. His wife, Albine, had once been Napoleon's mistress, and rumors swirled that she departed St. Helena pregnant with the emperor's child. Now Montholon hovered over the dying man, ready to prepare meals when servants were too ill or too afraid. It did not go unnoticed that Montholon rarely, if ever, succumbed to the mysterious sickness afflicting others. The question whispered in the dark grew sharper. Was Montholon a fellow victim of exile or something more sinister? Napoleon, aware of the shifting loyalties around him, took no chances. He began switching plates unexpectedly at meals, insisting that someone else taste every dish before he did. Sometimes he refused to eat altogether, surviving on sealed water and the few foods he trusted. Letters smuggled off the island described these routines and suspicions. Later, those letters would become damning evidence that the emperor had known, even then, that an invisible hand was slowly, methodically ending his life. Dr. Barry O'Meara, struggling to maintain his professional distance, grew increasingly worried about his patient's symptoms. He wrote cautiously in his private notes, avoiding outright accusations. Knowing that Governor Lowe's spies were everywhere, listening for a word of disloyalty. Yet the pattern was undeniable. Symptoms would peak when Montholon had exclusive access to food and wine, then recede when others intervened. It was a slow poisoning, too gradual to kill at once, too persistent to be natural. Members of the household began to record strange events. Bottles of wine were delivered already opened. The bread sometimes tasted of metal. Even the air at Longwood, thick with the must of damp rot and suspicion, seemed tinged with the scent of betrayal. The fear was not only for Napoleon, but for themselves. If an emperor could be so carefully, slowly destroyed, what hope had the rest? Outside, the Atlantic winds raged and the British garrison marched on, oblivious to the quiet terror inside Longwood's crumbling walls. The world at large believed Napoleon was simply fading away, undone by isolation and the whims of fate. But within the damp, dim rooms of Longwood, those closest to him began to understand the truth. Paradise, in the end, had become a place of calculated, invisible violence. And still, every morning, Napoleon woke to the same gray sky, the same groaning timbers, the same uncertain meals. Each day was a new test of trust, a fresh reckoning with mortality. Every symptom, a message, every suspicion, a wound. The walls of Longwood House did more than keep Napoleon in. They amplified every whisper, every sideways glance, until suspicion became as thick as the mold in the corners. By now, the emperor's world had narrowed not just to the damp rooms of his exile, but to a handful of faces. his dwindling retinue, his jailers, and most unnerving of all, those who called themselves friends. None cast a longer shadow than Count Charles de Montholon. Elegant, controlled, and outwardly devoted, Montholon became the gatekeeper of Napoleon's daily existence. He controlled the flow of information, the distribution of food, even the delicate task of managing the emperor's medicine. After Albine, his wife, and once Napoleon's confidant, departed St. Helena under circumstances clouded by gossip, Montholon's grip on the household only tightened. He was everywhere, offering to taste the wine, overseeing the preparation of meals, intercepting correspondence. To the British, he was the model of cooperation. To the French exiles, he became a figure of both necessity and dread. The rumors were endless, swirling through Longwood with each gust of ocean wind. Some whispered that Albine's child, born after her return to Europe, was Napoleon's. Others claimed that Montholon himself harbored secret negotiations with the restored Bourbon monarchy in France, a regime that had every reason to wish Napoleon gone forever. Financial records later revealed that following the emperor's death, Montholon's fortune suddenly improved, debts disappeared, and large sums from unknown sources filled his accounts. Was it gratitude, reward, or payment for a darker service? Trust fractured along invisible lines. Even among the loyal, paranoia flourished. Napoleon himself grew ever more wary, refusing to eat unless others tasted first, sometimes skipping meals entirely. He would, in moments of pain and clarity, question those around him. Had they noticed the strange taste in the bread, the bitter tinge in the wine? Why did some grow sick and others remain untouched? Marchand, the devoted valet, and General Gourgaud kept careful watch, recording odd incidents and furtive conversations. There were times when Montholon seemed too eager to please, stepping forward to medicate the emperor or manage his meals. Other times he withdrew in sullen silence as if resenting the constant surveillance. His proximity was both a comfort and a threat, an intimacy forced by circumstance but shadowed by the possibility of betrayal. The British, for their part, watched all this with a mixture of indifference and calculation. Governor Lowe, ever vigilant for plots and secret messages, believed the French were always scheming. But the real conspiracy, if it existed, was not of daring escapes or coded letters, but of slow destruction from within. The deadliest enemies were not always the ones outside the door. Yet even as Napoleon's suspicion sharpened, he was trapped. By illness, by isolation, and by the simple, devastating truth that betrayal was only possible from those close enough to matter. Allies became suspects. Every kindness was weighed for hidden motive. And still, the daily rituals continued. Meals shared, medicines administered, secrets kept behind guarded eyes. To be Napoleon in these final months was to live not only with pain, but with the knowledge that friendship and assassination might wear the same face. The most trusted could be the most dangerous, and the line between devotion and treachery had all but disappeared as winter yielded to the pale spring of 1821. A sense of crisis pressed in on Longwood House. The emperor's body, already ravaged, began to fail with new and alarming speed. In February, a brutal collapse overtook Napoleon. He vomited blood mixed with dark clots, his breath ragged, his skin drawn tight over bones. His voice, once commanding and precise, became a trembling whisper that faded into the hush of rain against the leaking roof. Summoned to this gathering disaster was Dr. Francesco Antomarchi, a Corsican physician dispatched to replace the dismissed Dr. O'Meara. Antomarchi catalogued every symptom with scientific rigor, noting not only the burning agony in Napoleon's abdomen, but also oddities that confounded explanation. Striking hair loss, drastic swings in weight, the persistent metallic taste that no medicine could erase. Antomarchi, like his predecessor, found the emperor's suffering did not fit the familiar script of stomach cancer alone. By now, the house itself had become a stage for anxiety and secrecy. Marchand and the other valets slept on the floor beside Napoleon's bed, ready to lift him upright when he choked or called out in delirium. General Bertrand, loyal since the sands of Egypt, hovered like a silent guardian, while Montholon managed access to the dying man's room with increasing possessiveness. The emperor's world had shrunk to the dimensions of a sickroom, its boundaries marked not by empire but by fever dreams and the rhythm of pain. Paranoia, always present, now burned through the household. Napoleon began refusing food unless someone else tasted it first. He switched plates at the last second, kept watch on who poured his wine, and broke the seals on water jugs himself, hands shaking. The suspicion that his death was no accident gnawed at him day and night. He told Bertrand and Marchand in a voice made hoarse by sickness that the English oligarchy had not been content to defeat him on the battlefield. They wished to see him erased, not merely as an emperor, but as a memory. Even the doctors could not agree. Antomarchi's notes pointed to cancer, but the course of Napoleon's decline, its fits and starts, sudden rallies followed by new depths, suggested a more complex and sinister cause. Members of the household recalled bottles of wine with broken seals, flour with a bitter aftertaste, meat crawling with corruption. Letters written in secret were slipped to trusted sailors, meant to leave a record of the emperor's fears and accusations. Some of these letters would only surface decades later, testimony from the margins of history. Throughout March, the household watched as Napoleon's strength ebbed away. His famous gray overcoat hung from his frame like a burial shroud. He could no longer walk without help, sometimes not even that. The emperor who had led charges at Austerlitz and Marengo now struggled to raise his own head. Marchand and the other attendants kept vigil at night, listening for the ragged, failing breath, dreading the next bout of convulsions that might prove fatal. In rare lucid moments, Napoleon dictated his will. Too weak to hold a pen, he spoke instructions for his possessions, his medals, his sword, keepsakes to be sent to his scattered family and loyal followers. But he also gave voice to darker suspicions, framing accusations that fell just short of naming names. "I die before my time," he said, "murdered by the English oligarchy and its hired assassin." To his son, he left not just relics, but a warning never to forget the treachery that brought the empire to ruin. By April, the air in Longwood was thick with resignation and dread. Doctors came and went, whispering in corners, their arguments unresolved. The British, afraid that even the emperor's death might spark rebellion or legend, increased the guard around the house. Requests for a Catholic priest to attend Napoleon were denied, then delayed, as if spiritual comfort might itself be a form of escape. Inside the sickroom, time fractured. Days passed in fever pain and the strange slow hush of a great life reaching its end. An emperor reduced to a figure both pitied and feared, surrounded by medicine bottles, broken trust, and the unyielding riddle of his own demise. The world outside Longwood carried on. Waves crashed on volcanic cliffs. The British Guard changed their posts with mechanical discipline. The damp wind rattled shutters as it always had. But inside, in the small sickroom that had become Napoleon's whole universe, time lost its meaning. Each hour was thick with suspicion, grief, and the dull ache of a body failing from within. Napoleon's mind, once sharp enough to hold the movements of armies and the fates of kings, was increasingly consumed by fear and mistrust. He would lie awake, heart racing, haunted by visions of faceless poisoners and the sense that every shadow in the room could be the harbinger of death. Sleep, when it came, brought nightmares. Assassins at his bedside, wine that tasted of blood, old friends transformed into traitors. At times he would wake screaming or gasping, clutching the sheets as if to anchor himself to the last shreds of reality. The circle of those he trusted narrowed to almost nothing. Even Bertrand, Marchand, and the loyal valets became subjects of secret tests. Napoleon would sometimes offer them his food, watching their faces as they tasted, as though searching for the faintest sign of distress. He changed routines without warning. He demanded that every plate, every bottle, every scrap of bread be accounted for, and often refused to eat unless he broke the seal himself. On more than one occasion, he poured a cup of wine out onto the floor rather than risk another mouthful. The few times he managed to write, or rather to dictate since his hands were too weak to hold a pen for long, he filled page after page with instructions. There were last bequests, locks of his hair to be sent to family and loyal officers, tokens of a legacy he knew would outlast the reach of his enemies. To his son, Napoleon Francois, he sent a sword and medals, but more than anything, a message. Let him never forget that he was born a French prince. The words hung in the air, weighted with grief for a child he had not seen since infancy. But the will was more than an inventory of possessions. Interwoven with practical matters were veiled accusations, dark hints at murder, betrayal, and the knowledge that history would be forced to ask hard questions. Napoleon's final testament did not name his poisoner, but it left no doubt that he believed his death was being hastened by design. The atmosphere at Longwood grew stifling. Marchand and the others took turns sleeping on the cold floor beside Napoleon's bed, listening for his strained breathing and ready to lift him when the fits of vomiting struck. Sometimes in delirium he called out to Josephine or argued with ghosts of enemies long dead. At other times, he would mutter about English plots, the malice of the oligarchy, or the treachery of those closest to him. There were moments of heartbreaking lucidity, too, when he asked about France, about his son, or simply stared out the rain-streaked window in silence. With each passing day, Napoleon's world contracted further. He was no longer able to leave his bed, and light seemed to fade from the room even in daylight. His body, once so formidable, now weighed less than 90 pounds. The famous gray coat hung off him like a burial shroud, and even the simple act of drinking water became a trial. For those watching over him, the daily routine, feeding, cleaning, trying to offer comfort, became a ritual of mourning performed for a man still alive but already half gone. Rumors multiplied in the British camp and among the French exiles that the emperor was dying, that the end was near, that something unspeakable was happening in the heart of Longwood House. Yet for all the whispers, the world outside remained unmoved. The guards did not falter. The governor remained remote and unyielding. The machinery of exile ground on, indifferent to the suffering behind its walls. In these final days, as pain and suspicion threatened to swallow everything, Napoleon clung to the last power available to him, the power to bear witness. In his will, in his words to those few he trusted, he ensured that the story of his suffering would survive, even if his body and name were erased by those who feared him most. In this way, even as life ebbed, he transformed from captive to accuser, from dying man to the author of a legend that would haunt his enemies long after his heart stopped beating. The valley chosen for Napoleon's grave, shadowed by trees and crossed by a cold spring, seemed at first an oasis of peace, a gentle reprieve after the brutal squalor of Longwood. On the morning of May 9th, 1821, a funeral procession wound slowly down the slope. British officers, French exiles in mourning black, and islanders drawn by curiosity or awe. The coffin was heavy, lead-lined, sealed against the elements, as if even death required a fortress. But peace was elusive. The inscription on the tombstone, a matter of bitter dispute, bore only the words, "General Bonaparte." Governor Lowe, determined to deny the emperor even the dignity of a name, refused all requests for Napoleon. The French household, incensed, rejected the compromise, and so the grave was left unmarked, only a block of stone atop the soil, watched over by soldiers with unreadable faces. Within days, the valley grew haunted by uncertainty. Rumors ran wild. Some claimed to see strange lights by the graveside at night. Others heard voices carried on the wind. There were whispers that the burial had been faked, or that the body in the ground was not Napoleon's at all. The British maintained a constant guard, more out of fear of theft or rescue than respect. For those who had lived through years of suspicion, it was difficult to believe that any part of the story was as simple as it seemed. The exiles left behind at Longwood found little solace in ritual. Marchand, Bertrand, and the handful of loyalists walked the rooms in silence, haunted by memories of their master's last hours. Marchand wrote in his journal that the house felt emptier than death itself, every sound magnified, every shadow lingering longer than it should. There was no comfort in the thought of the emperor at rest, only the uneasy sense that some vital reckoning remained unfinished. More disturbing still was the preservation of Napoleon's body. In the weeks after burial, stories circulated of soldiers who, assigned to guard the tombs, swore that the earth did not settle as it should, or that odd crystalline substances appeared on the coffin when it was briefly exhumed. Nearly 2 decades later, when the grave was opened to return Napoleon's remains to France, witnesses were shocked. The corpse, though pale and discolored, was strikingly intact. Features recognizable, clothing barely decayed. Doctors would later point to arsenic's preserving effect on flesh, feeding suspicions that poison, not disease, had been the true cause of death. Superstition mingled with political anxiety. Some islanders believed Napoleon's ghost wandered the hills, unable to find rest, while the truth of his end remained hidden. Others said the valley grew colder each night, that no grass would grow upon the grave. Among the French exiles, conversation turned to omens. A candlestick falling without reason, a chill at the back of the neck, dreams of the emperor standing silent in the fog. Longwood, abandoned and rotting, became a monument to regret. The missing organs, the heart, the stomach, remained another source of speculation and conspiracy. Some said they had been smuggled to France, others that Governor Lowe kept them as trophies, or that they were destroyed to prevent forensic discovery. Even the story of Napoleon's relics took on a ghastly dimension as strange objects appeared in private collections across Europe, each claiming to be a piece of the fallen emperor. In the years that followed, the question of what happened at St. Helena became a wound that would not heal. The British government, quick to close the record, filed away its documents. The French monarchy avoided the subject entirely, unwilling to revisit the shadows that still clung to their restored throne. For those who had witnessed Napoleon's last days, however, the truth, whatever it was, refused to rest in peace, echoing through empty rooms and unmarked graves, a ghost story the world could neither believe nor forget. In the decades after Napoleon's burial, St. Helena faded from the front pages, but not from the minds of those haunted by the mysteries of his end. When, in 1840, the French government persuaded Britain to return Napoleon's remains to Paris, a new chapter in the legend began, a journey not only of the emperor's body but of rumor, suspicion, and forensic curiosity. The exhumation of Napoleon's grave stunned witnesses. After nearly 20 years underground, the emperor's corpse had barely decayed. His face, though pale and shrunken, was recognizable. His uniform, insignia, and even his boots looked untouched by time. Some wept at the sight, calling it a miracle. Others, especially the few doctors present, whispered another word: arsenic. The same chemical suspected in his death was known for its power to preserve flesh, a silent confirmation of the suspicions long held by those closest to him. The return to France was no less dramatic. Napoleon's coffin paraded through the streets of Paris drew vast crowds. Old soldiers wept openly, and the myth of the martyred emperor swelled to fill the boulevards. Yet beneath the pageantry, a quiet revolution was unfolding. A revolution not of armies, but of science. It began with hair. Locks of Napoleon's hair, snipped by loyal attendants at his deathbed and sent to friends and family across Europe, became the unlikely key to the emperor's fate. Decades later, as chemistry advanced, these strands were analyzed for traces of poison. In the 1960s, Swedish dentist Sten Forshofood used neutron activation analysis to test several authentic samples. The results were astonishing. Arsenic levels 40 times higher than normal, with clear spikes that matched periods when Napoleon had been most ill. These findings, challenged, debated, but never fully refuted, transformed Napoleon's death from a historical puzzle to a forensic case study. Some historians argued for alternate explanations. The green pigment in Longwood's damp wallpaper made from arsenic-based dye could have emitted toxic fumes. Medicines of the era sometimes contained arsenic as a tonic, yet these did not account for the distinct pattern of poisoning or for the evidence found in preserved tissues and relics. The case soon grew more complicated. Other scientists tested bone fragments, tooth enamel, and even the lead that had lined Napoleon's coffin. In every artifact, traces of arsenic were found, sometimes at deadly levels, sometimes as background noise in a world already full of toxins. Each test provided a new piece of the puzzle, but also new questions. Was the poison delivered in food, in wine, in medicine? Was it inhaled, ingested, or both? Alongside the forensic hunt, old letters and diaries resurfaced, some long forgotten, others newly declassified. These included first-hand accounts of suspicious food, sudden illnesses among the staff, broken seals on bottles, and the peculiar behavior of Count Montholon. The same pattern appeared in multiple testimonies. Napoleon's symptoms would worsen after certain meals, or when Montholon had exclusive access to the kitchen. The more science illuminated, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. For every fact, there was a contradiction. For every clue, a competing theory. Even modern researchers struggled to account for the irregular rhythm of Napoleon's decline. The sudden rallies, the rapid collapses, the way his body seemed both to resist and succumb to death's slow approach. One thing was certain: Napoleon's death could no longer be dismissed as a simple act of nature. The physical evidence, the preserved relics, the measured poison in his very hair, these became the seeds of doubt, growing ever more tangled with the legend of an emperor who, even in death, refused to disappear quietly. As the evidence of poisoning grew harder to ignore, so too did the whispers of conspiracy that had long hovered over Napoleon's exile. The question was no longer simply whether he had been murdered, but who might have ordered it, and who, across 2 continents, had conspired to keep the truth entombed. For years, competing explanations jostled for supremacy. Some insisted the source was environmental. The infamous Shields green wallpaper in Napoleon's damp rooms laced with arsenic that leached into the air whenever the humidity spiked. Others pointed to 19th century medicines which often included arsenic in their recipes, or to accidental contamination from the poorly stored food and water that plagued all of Longwood. But these explanations faltered before the forensic record. The pattern of poisoning, the recurring spikes of arsenic exposure that aligned not with wallpaper or tonics, but with key moments of household intrigue. Attention returned again and again to Count Montholon. Investigations into his finances uncovered mysterious payments after Napoleon's death, enough to clear old debts and elevate his lifestyle well beyond the reach of a mere exile. Rumors in Paris, stoked by fragments of letters later unearthed in the French National Archives, suggested direct contact between Montholon and agents of the Bourbon monarchy, restored to power after Napoleon's fall. What had passed between them? Did the royalists, fearful of a Bonapartist resurgence, quietly pay for the emperor's silence? The British, too, came under scrutiny. Recently declassified documents revealed that Governor Lowe was under pressure from London. Napoleon must never leave St. Helena alive. Coded dispatches hinted at a deep-seated fear, not just of escape, but of the myth Napoleon might inspire, even as a living relic. Some correspondents even suggested that the climate be allowed to take its natural course. A chilling euphemism, perhaps, for a campaign of passive or not-so-passive murder. Researchers and writers who tried to pry open these archives found themselves stymied by missing pages, redacted lines, and inexplicable bureaucratic delays. Official British files related to Napoleon's exile, even 2 centuries on, remained partly classified on grounds of national security. French records, though more open, were littered with gaps, the fingerprints of censors and nervous bureaucrats determined to leave certain questions forever unanswered. Meanwhile, private memoirs and family papers continued to surface, each shedding a little more light and a great deal more shadow. Some recounted overheard conversations about solving the Bonaparte problem. Others described unknown visitors to Longwood's kitchens by night, or British officials taking a suspicious interest in the food supply. Even years after the emperor's burial, islanders would speak of a white powder found on storeroom floors, hurriedly swept away before anyone could ask questions. Montholon, for his part, offered no confession, only silence and at times a veiled unease. His sudden prosperity, his ambiguous loyalties, and his proximity to the dying emperor made him the focus of endless speculation. Had he acted alone, or as part of a network of interests, royalist, British, personal, intertwined by the opportunity and the will to remove a legend from the board forever? In the end, the archives of Europe seemed designed not to preserve the truth, but to conceal it, layer upon layer of secrecy, omission, and lost evidence. For those who tried to trace the chain of betrayal, the journey only ever led deeper into shadow. News of Napoleon's death radiated across Europe like a tremor. Within days, rumors of poison, betrayal, and secret murder began to circulate, carried by the same winds that had once blown his banners across the continent. To the French, especially veterans of the empire and those with Bonapartist sympathies, the news of exile and slow death was not just a tragedy, it was a call to memory and defiance. In Paris, grief became performance. Crowds gathered in darkened cafes, old soldiers pinned faded medals to tattered coats, and poets, some in whispers, others in open challenge, accused the English of judicial murder. The legend of Napoleon's suffering on St. Helena was seized upon by Bonapartists and Republicans alike. For them, his agony was proof of the monarchy's fear and of British perfidy. Napoleon had been made into a martyr, a victim of Europe's restored order. "We poison Napoleon on his rock and call it policy," Lord Byron wrote, capturing both the outrage and the sense of historical inevitability. The ripples spread further. In Italy, revolutionaries swore oaths of vengeance against the emperor's poisoners, and in Poland, priests offered mass for his soul. Even in England, the story of his suffering gave rise to unease. Radical newspapers published lurid accounts of St. Helena, and not a few members of Parliament privately wondered if their government had traded honor for convenience. William Cobbett, the fiery British journalist, accused his countrymen of having committed the foulest murder in the guise of natural death. The legend had grown larger than the man. For the restored Bourbon monarchy, the rumors were a constant threat. They worked to control the narrative, suppressing stories of poisoning and emphasizing Napoleon's supposed natural decline. But even official histories could not extinguish the sense that something monstrous had been done to the ogre of Corsica, and that in defeating him, both France and Britain had lost some measure of their own honor. The political uses of the poison myth multiplied. For Bonapartists, it transformed their fallen leader into a Christ-like figure, betrayed, tormented, and silenced by the powerful. For Republicans, it was evidence of the monarchy's corruption and the cruelty of Europe's old order. For nationalists everywhere, it became a symbol. If Napoleon the Mighty could be murdered by inches in a foreign prison, what protection did lesser men have from the secret violence of kings? The world watched as Napoleon's legacy became a tool in battles far beyond his tomb. His image, pale, shrunken but unbroken, adorned pamphlets, paintings, and banners. His supposed last words were quoted in the streets of Paris and the squares of Milan. "I die before my time, murdered by the English oligarchy and its hired assassin." It did not matter whether every word was was true, it mattered that it could be believed. History in this moment became less a matter of fact than of passion, less about the details of a death than the uses of a legend. And in the halls of power from London to Vienna, there was a growing recognition that, in trying to erase Napoleon from history, they had instead helped write him into immortality. As years passed, the controversy over Napoleon's death refused to fade. Modern science pressed deeper into the mystery, searching for certainty where rumor and politics had left only confusion. In laboratories and libraries, chemists and historians pored over the relics. A lock of hair, a button from his uniform, shards of bone and glass from Longwood House. Each object became a clue, and sometimes a provocation. In 2001, forensic toxicologists used advanced techniques to test strands of Napoleon's hair preserved in museum archives. The results were as chilling as they were precise. Not only was there an abnormally high level of arsenic, but the pattern of exposure showed fluctuations, spikes and valleys, that matched periods of acute illness and relative recovery described in diaries from St. Helena. The implication was devastating. This was not the passive poisoning of wallpaper or bad medicine. It was calculated, sustained, and timed. Other researchers found evidence of secondary toxins, traces of mercury, antimony, and possibly even cyanide, suggesting that if Napoleon was murdered, it was by a cocktail of poisons administered by someone with both access and knowledge. Chemical analysis of objects Napoleon handled in his last months, the snuff box, the wine glasses, even his famous gray overcoat, revealed further residues, as if the very environment of Longwood had been turned against him. But science did not speak with one voice. Skeptics pointed to the limitations of historical forensics. Contamination was possible, records imperfect, and the evidence circumstantial. Some maintain that Napoleon's symptoms still best match stomach cancer, or that chronic low-level arsenic exposure could explain both his preservation and his decline. The debate itself became a battleground, with each new study adding fuel to one side or the other. Meanwhile, the legend continued to grow. Napoleon's death mask, made hours after his passing, was studied by artists and pathologists alike. Some saw in its gaunt features the unmistakable signs of arsenic's rictus smile. Others insisted it was simply the face of a man worn out by suffering and betrayal. Museums aware of the controversy displayed relics behind glass, allowing visitors to draw their own conclusions about the mystery of St. Helena. For many, the most haunting evidence lay in the emperor's own words. "I die before my time, murdered by the English oligarchy and its hired assassin." He had, in his last lucid days, anticipated the very amnesia and denial that would follow his death. "They will say I died of cancer like my father." It serves everyone's purpose. The English avoid the shame of murder. The Bourbons escape the guilt of regicide. My enemies can pretend they defeated me fairly. But you know the truth. Make sure someone someday tells it. And so, long after the wounds had healed and the island had grown quiet again, the weight of truth, or at least the weight of suspicion, remained. The question was no longer just how Napoleon had died, but why the world was so desperate to forget or to explain away the possibility of murder. As visitors walked through the preserved rooms of Longwood House, brushing their fingers along faded wallpaper and tarnished furniture, They could sense that history was still alive here, not as a settled story, but as a living argument, unfinished and unresolved. The legend of Napoleon's final days was no longer just about an emperor, but about all the hidden currents beneath the surface of official history. The politics of memory, the price of power, and the uneasy silence of those who guard the secrets of the past. In the centuries since Napoleon's passing, St. Helena has become a place of uneasy pilgrimage. The rooms of Longwood House have been painstakingly restored, the gardens trimmed and catalogued, the emperor's simple camp bed displayed behind glass as if it were a holy relic. Yet even with every effort to tidy up the past, the air inside still feels heavy, haunted by what was suffered and what remains unsaid. Historians, journalists, and the merely curious still seek answers in the shadows left behind. They request access to government archives only to be met with closed doors and bureaucratic deflection even after 200 years. Why, visitors ask, do the British still withhold certain documents? What could be dangerous now so long after the fact? French researchers too find gaps in their national story. Letters missing, memoirs redacted, files lost in war or deliberately destroyed. Tour guides at Longwood speak in hushed tones about the green wallpaper, the odd preservation of Napoleon's body, the rumors of missing organs. They point out the copper bathtub, the battered chair, the desk where the emperor once wrote instructions and accusations. But some stories are told only after hours, when the last group has departed and the evening mist creeps across the hills. There are tales of guards who fell ill after service at Longwood, of servants who swore they heard voices at night, of a lockbox belonging to Count Montholon opened after his death, containing nothing but a single white feather. A symbol perhaps of cowardice or guilt, or maybe just an enigma left to mock the living. The silence from officialdom grows more eloquent with every year. In the refusal to disclose, in the meticulous avoidance of certain words and facts, there is an admission that some histories are too dangerous or too useful ever to be fully told. The British, by not confronting the reality of their prisoner's end, avoid a stain on their legacy. The restored Bourbons and later French governments have their own reasons to keep the narrative vague. And so the myth persists, a thread of suspicion woven through centuries of commemoration. Even the relics that survive, Napoleon's hair, his snuff box, his uniform, speak of ambiguity. Each is both memento and evidence, a silent witness that invites questions no authority dares to answer. For those who believe in murder, they are relics of a crime. For skeptics, they are proof only of how legend and longing shape what we see. What finally does it mean that Napoleon's story ends not with a battle nor even a trial, but with a whisper of poison, betrayal, and memory denied? The emperor, stripped of all armies and power, left only one weapon: the ability to haunt those who had destroyed him. His death, unresolved, forces each generation to confront the same ancient question: what is truth, and who owns it? As long as the Atlantic wind rattles the shutters at Longwood, as long as visitors stand before Napoleon's unmarked grave and wonder, that question will never be put to rest. As the world moves steadily onward, the mystery of Napoleon's death refuses to settle into silence. Each new generation brings fresh eyes and renewed debate, weaving its own anxieties into the unresolved legacy of Saint Helena. For some, the story is a warning, a parable about the reach of power and the willingness of governments to reshape reality for their own ends. For others, it is an invitation, a reminder that even in defeat, the greatest figures of history retain the power to unsettle and inspire. Across Europe, Napoleon's image endures, on statues and paintings in the hearts of those who still debate the merits and crimes of his empire. School children recite his battles and dates, rarely knowing the details of his decline. Tourists visit Les Invalides in Paris, where the red sarcophagus stands under a dome of gold, its grandeur giving no clue to the uncertainties and shadows of the emperor's final days. Historians, too, remain divided. Was Napoleon a visionary undone by circumstance and betrayal, or the architect of his own destruction? Was his death the result of nature, neglect, or a calculated campaign of slow assassination? Each theory finds its champion, and each piece of evidence, real or circumstantial, becomes part of the endless argument that circles his grave. Yet perhaps the real lesson of St. Helena is not to be found in the answer, but in the search itself. The myth of Napoleon's poisoning endures not simply because of science or politics, but because it speaks to a deeper human longing for justice, for clarity, for stories in which villains are unmasked and wrongs are made right. In the absence of certainty, people fill the gaps with meaning, turning history into parable, tragedy, or warning as they need. For the descendants of those who once stood at Napoleon's bedside, the legacy is more personal. Some guard locks of his hair as sacred relics. Others whisper stories passed down through generations, accounts of bravery or betrayal, hope or loss. Each family, in its own way, keeps the flame alive, refusing to let the emperor's memory fade into official silence. In the end, Napoleon's most lasting victory may be this: that centuries after his fall, he cannot be contained or forgotten. His presence lingers not just in marble or manuscript, but in the questions that refuse to die, the mysteries, the doubts, the stubborn refusal to let the story end. Even now, as the Atlantic wind sweeps over the cliffs of St. Helena, the world listens for the footsteps of a vanished emperor and finds in the silence a story still unfolding. Time has rolled on, softening memories and blurring the sharp edges of suffering. But Napoleon's final chapter remains curiously unfinished. Generations have sifted through the evidence, seeking certainty and finding only echoes. The past is dense with contradiction, science matched by superstition, testimony shadowed by secrecy. St. Helena stands unchanged in the South Atlantic, an outpost caught between myth and reality, forever marked by the presence of a prisoner who would not be quietly erased. In museums and archives across the world, fragments of Napoleon's last years are preserved behind glass. His death mask, its lips frozen in a rictus both peaceful and tormented, has become a mirror for all who ponder the cost of power and the nature of justice. The arsenic traces in hair, the patterns in diaries, the missing organs, the government files still stamped confidential after 2 centuries. All are pieces in a puzzle with no final picture. There are those who find meaning in this uncertainty. The unresolved questions lend the story a kind of immortality, inviting each age to test its own beliefs against the enigma of the emperor's death. Did the British orchestrate a careful, deniable murder? Did French royalists conspire from afar? Or did time and disease, indifferent and pitiless, simply claim a man whom no enemy could defeat outright? The answers, elusive as ever, change shape with every telling. What endures most powerfully is not the poison itself, nor even the drama of Napoleon's decline, but the way his dying became a stage upon which the whole world acted out its fears and ambitions. The suspicion of betrayal, the tension between fact and legend, the use of silence and denial as weapons, these are not relics of one man's story, but persistent themes in the chronicles of power everywhere. St. Helena, windswept and solitary, is visited now by tourists, historians, and the curious. They walk the same corridors, peer into the same battered rooms, and wonder at the mysteries that remain. If they listen closely, they might hear the echoes. The scrape of boots on gravel, the hushed voices in candlelit rooms, the final words whispered in the darkness. The island is an archive of absence, a reminder that some truths can only be guessed at, never fully known. And so the story continues, an ending without end, a question that survives all attempts at closure. The legend of Napoleon's last days is not just a chapter in history, but a mirror held up to the ambitions, hopes, and fears of all who come after. We return to it again and again, drawn by the unfinished business of the past. One can imagine in the silence of a stormy night on St. Helena that the emperor himself understood this best. Truth, like arsenic, he might have mused, leaves traces that no time can erase. In the slow fading of power, in the unresolved silence of exile, that poisoned legacy lives on.